Well, thank you for joining us today for New Findings in Carbon Cycle Science. With us today we have Sarah Cooley from Ocean Conservancy. We have Abhishek Chatterjee from NASA Goddard Space Flight Center, and the University Space Research Association. And we have Marc Kramer from Washington State University in Vancouver. And I'm going to turn this over to Sarah.
Thank you, Liza. I'm Sarah Cooley. I am at Ocean Conservancy. And today I'll be telling you a little bit about what we found as we went through constructing Chapter 17 of the second state of the carbon cycle report. We were focused in that chapter on the effects, the biogeochemical effects of rising atmospheric CO2 on terrestrial and ocean systems. My colleague, David Moore from University of Arizona, was my fellow lead author, and he will actually be presenting in a session dedicated to the SOCR2 report on Thursday afternoon. I definitely encourage you to check it out. The session is B43C, and it's in room 150A. So we're pretty excited about all the talks that'll be happening in that session. There we go. The second state of the carbon cycle report is, it's kind of a big deal. It's a very technical activity, but it's an important, highly influential report from anchored by the U.S. Global Change Research Program. So it's an interagency assessment of the state of the carbon cycle across North America, including the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Authors and experts came from all of those places. And the assessment really looks at all of the aspects of carbon cycling in these different geographies. And so some of the things are global lessons, but then there's also very localized, place-based lessons as well. So the experts who wrote the report came from the government, national laboratories, universities, research institutions, and the private sector. There were over 200 experts involved, so it was really a huge undertaking. It went through 6 stages of review by federal agencies and departments, as well as the general public and an external expert review panel that the National Academies of Science convened. And the SOCR2 report contributes to Volume 2 of the congressionally mandated 4th National Climate Assessment. So over the Thanksgiving holiday, there was a lot of press beginning about the National Climate Assessment, which was sort of the headline influential report that was released. But that same day, SOCR2 was also released. So really, the two reports operate hand in hand. And then finally, just to note that the U.S. Carbon Cycle Science Plan is really coordinating and developing the SOCR2 report, and it was led by the Carbon Cycle Interagency Working Group under USGCRP's leadership. The SOCR2 report has the very nice technical brief that is, or report in brief. This is actually available at the USGCRP booth upstairs. The booth is number 1547, and they've also got little globe-wrapped chocolates. I invite you to go take a look. But anyway, the report in brief, which I'm holding here, contains the highlights in plain language and the technical executive summary. The whole report is 878 pages, so it's really best to be accessed online. And there are 4 interconnected sections in the report. First, the first section is all about just sort of synthesis. Where are we now? Then the human dimensions of the carbon cycle, and then the state of the land, air, and water, and then the 4th section, consequences and the ways forward, is the section that my chapter, Chapter 17, is part of, and then Abhishek's chapter, Chapter 19, is part of. So we'll be emphasizing that piece of the report, talking to you today. And there's 19 chapters in the report, followed by 7 appendices, and the entire website, or the entire report, is available at that website down below. So carbon2018.globalchange.gov. So first of all, just as by way of background, I wanted to explain what we're seeing in terms of rising atmospheric carbon dioxide. On the left, the pie chart shows the global mean emissions, and this data originates from the Global Carbon Project. Recall that 1 petagram is the same as 10 to the 15th grams, so that's a whole lot of grams. It's also the same as 1 gigaton. And so the Global Carbon Project does an annual update looking at the global mean emissions, which are shown on the left, and then the partitioning of those global emissions shown on the right. On the left, fossil fuels and industry were really responsible for the vast majority of carbon dioxide emitted per year for the time span between 2007 and 2016. Land use change was a smaller fraction of that, but still quite important. And then the destination of the carbon dioxide from global CO2 emissions really breaks out on the right side pie. And what my personal expertise is really on the ocean uptake side, which is 2.4 petagrams of carbon per year. And then my chapter also examined the land uptake, which is about 3 petagrams of carbon per year. So the ocean partition is really responsible for about 24% of the per year CO2 emissions uptake by the ocean. So going into the ocean effects of rising carbon dioxide, what we see is that rising carbon dioxide is really decreasing seawater pH around the world. On the upper left, we have the atmospheric carbon dioxide level. This should be pretty familiar to most of you focusing on geosciences. And what we see is a steady increase over the decades in atmospheric carbon dioxide. And so this drives a phenomenon called ocean acidification, and ocean acidification can be measured at time series stations around the world. And so what we show here is actually a few select stations with the longest term time series. And then in these other graphs, we have the carbon dioxide concentration in the water in all of these locations featured. And then we have other aspects of the inorganic dissolved carbon dioxide system in the water. And what I really want you to notice here is that the rate of CO2 increase in the atmosphere is really being matched by the rate of uptake by the water. We're seeing it happen around the world, and we have seen ocean acidification affect some marine species already, and it's altered ecosystems and ecosystem processes. More of this is really likely, and we have very high confidence in this result. So, excuse me. Recall the fraction of carbon dioxide that's going into land. Atmospheric carbon dioxide is really, homogeneous around the world. It's rising worldwide. But the fraction that is interacting with the land is really affecting processes on land by local climate and by dominant species. So this is actually a figure from our chapter. And this actually shows how different, I hope you can see a little bit of the text on the back, but really different dominant species in different climatic regions have different responses. And so the darker green in this plot is actually showing a greater relative response to carbon dioxide, assuming responses are increasing with nutrient availability and drought stress. So what's really important to know here is that the land effects of rising carbon dioxide are really varying depending on so many factors. The climate, the dominant species, the availability of nutrients, and the drought stress that a particular area is under. So the land effects of rising carbon dioxide, aside from the climate effects, the thermal effects that we are most often accustomed to thinking about, are that we know that the decade scale predictions are incredibly difficult to make because rising carbon dioxide is expected to increase photosynthesis, plant growth, and water use efficiency. But at the same time, there's all these interactive feedback effects that I pointed to on the last slide. We know that rising carbon dioxide likely changes carbon storage on land, certainly terrestrial hydrology, and biogeochemical cycling. But the effects on the vegetation composition and the nutrient feedbacks are very, very difficult to predict. So we know that rising carbon dioxide impacts benefits to people. There are some very difficult to predict changes in the benefits that both land and ocean systems are providing to humans. So we have seen terrestrial crop yields are changing because of the carbon fertilization effect and because of warming as well. And in the water, we see that ocean acidification has changed the supply of shellfish larvae in land-based aquaculture. And we know that there will be other impacts to ocean food webs from ocean acidification, and in very complex feedback forms, again, that depend on ecosystem structure and habitat and competition and things that are beyond the scope of simply rising carbon dioxide levels. So in the future, we are looking at it's difficult to predict. It is really uncertain that the land and ocean are going to continue taking up carbon dioxide at a rate similar to what they've been done before. And the reason that this is so complex is because of the feedbacks I've touched on. It's still very unclear how the climate and environmental feedbacks are going to interact with carbon sinks and rising atmospheric CO2. So you can imagine a seesaw, a child's toy. So when rising temperature releases carbon dioxide from land and the ocean, that's something that we can all imagine. But on the other hand, when you have rising carbon dioxide, it increases the uptake of carbon dioxide by the land and the ocean. But these two sort of seesaws are kind of competing with each other. If we imagine connecting them at the center, you'd have a very hard to predict system. And that system really depends on so many other factors, minerals and microbes and precipitation and evaporation and weathering, photosynthesis and respiration. And melting. And all of these things are very, very difficult to dig into because there are so many complex feedbacks. At this point, I will turn it over to my colleague Abhishek, who will talk a little bit more in detail about future projections. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. So I'll wait for the slides to come up. Yeah, no, it is here. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Abhishek Chatterjee. I'm a carbon cycle scientist with the University Space Research Association and the Global Modeling and Assimilation Office at NASA Goddard Space Flight Center. So Sarah did a great job of giving a brief overview of the second state of the carbon cycle report, or SOCR2 as we'll keep on calling it, and also a brief overview of the overall carbon cycle and the different components. Now, what we have, or what I'm going to talk about primarily, is the work that we have done in this last chapter of the report, which is chapter 19, and which is called The Future of the North American Carbon Cycle. This is, again, available in this sort of report in brief. It has got a great summary of that. So what we focused on was trying to actually look at what the future projections or future changes in the carbon cycle will be based on a number of published studies and available data sets. And what these studies do is essentially they try to look at these changes by using model projections which take into account what the past trends were, what the current data and knowledge is, and assumptions about future scenarios. And those are some of the key findings from that chapter. That's what I'll talk about. So the first one is that we know, or we keep on seeing, is that fossil fuel emissions and emissions from land use and land change, they are and will continue to be a primary driver of carbon cycle change. This is something that we have always seen, and even though within the past decade what we have observed is that there is a decoupling of the growth in CO2 emissions from fossil fuel and increase in GDP, but this trend will keep on moving forward. Now by 2040, model projections, or projections based on data from different sources, suggest that the total North American fossil fuel carbon emissions could range from a 12.8% decrease to a 3% increase compared to the 2015 levels. And these data sets are available or based on synthesis from 3 sources for the US, Canada, and Mexico, which are listed here. And the references are listed here. Now, each of these sources actually give us a set of high emission scenarios and a set of low emission scenarios. And what we did as part of this chapter, and also another chapter in the report, chapter 3, what we did was actually synthesize the information from those different sources into looking at the total projections for North America. And that's where these set of numbers for 2040 arrive from. Now, of course, there are uncertainties in these projections, and those primarily result from future energy decisions and developments, including policies, technologies, prices, economic growth, and demand. The second key finding that I would like to talk about is what the trajectory of the natural carbon sinks will be. So land and coastal waters of North America currently act as a carbon sink, which means that they take up more carbon than they release on an annual basis. However, we do see that these sinks are diminishing in strength, and many are at risk into the future, primarily from events like deforestation or sort of impact on forests, such as insects, pests, wildfires, and as well as there are increased changes that are happening in the northern high latitudes, and I'll be talking about that in a bit more later, as well as changes in land use management and land cover management practices. Now, for this particular slide here, I'm just going to focus on the land carbon sink component. If you want to look at or learn more about the response of the ocean or the coastal waters, then again, I would like you to go and take a look at the chapter where we have more details. Now, for the land component, what we did was sort of look at the emissions or projections from an ensemble of model simulations. Now, these are the same model simulations that informed the IPCC fifth assessment report. And if you sort of focus on the figure that is here in the bottom, what we have there is that for each of different scenarios, these are called as a representative concentration pathways, or RCPs. And what they do is take into account different type of socioeconomic pathways which actually takes into account also what the fossil fuel emissions and the land use emissions will be, and then also potentially what the impact will be on greenhouse gas concentrations. So they fold all of that information in, and for each of these 4 RCP scenarios, we looked at the ensemble of model simulations to look at the range or what the response of the land carbon sink will be. And quite interestingly, we found, or not surprisingly, we actually found that as you get further into time, so as we get into the 2050 or 2100, then there is sort of a wide spread that we see in this model projections. In fact, sort of there are 2 shaded bars that you see here. The lighter colored bars, they show the snapshot in time for 2050 to 2059. And the darker colored bars, they show the snapshot in time for 2090 up to like 2099. And for them, especially once we get into the higher emission scenarios, so the RCP 8.5, what we see is that the models project that North America could be a land net sink of up to 1.5 petagram carbon, or it can be a source of 0.6 petagram carbon. And that's like a huge swing based on where we currently are. Now, the large uncertainty that we have, of course, comes from this combined and uncertain effects of rising CO2, which Sarah already talked about, climate change, emission scenarios, and land use management. The third key finding that I'll talk about briefly here is the impact or the changes that we are seeing in the northern high latitudes. So soils store a vast amount of carbon, especially in Alaska and Canada, and as the temperatures are rising, the thawing permafrost is releasing that previously stored carbon into the atmosphere. Now, this can, of course, both amplify the rate and magnitude of climate warming. Now, if we actually look at sort of the changes in mean annual surface air temperature, then this is where we see profound effects or profound changes that are happening in the high latitudes. In fact, compared to rises in global temperature, over the high latitude, temperatures are increasing almost 2.5 times faster. And this, of course, has a big impact on the permafrost. So this figure here shows a pan-Arctic view of the permafrost zone as well as the different vegetation biomes. The carbon in the northern high latitudes, they actually respond not just to like what we call as pulse or gradual disturbances, such as changing temperature and precipitation, but they do have a tendency to respond to like abrupt events, such as an abrupt permafrost thaw, or like insects, or like fires, etc. The soils in the northern high latitudes actually store almost about 1,500 petagram carbon, so which is almost twice than what we have in the atmosphere. And the current model projections show that by 2100, at least 5 to 15% of the soil carbon pool is vulnerable to release. Now, a set of model simulations also tend to indicate that as the soil carbon there declines, there's also the option that essentially some of the vegetation uptake can help regulate the carbon source. But however, there is very little empirical evidence that that's currently happening, other than a few places in the tundra where we do observe changes in the vegetation. But of course, there is again a large uncertainty in this, and sort of the primary knowledge gaps actually come from this limited measurements that are taken or available over this region, and a basic mechanistic understanding of how this abrupt permafrost thaw happens and how we include that process into our models. So just to recap sort of the three main findings from this chapter, the first one related to fossil fuel emissions, where by 2040, based on sources or available sources, we project that North America could either be a 12.8% decrease or a 3% increase in total absolute fossil fuel emissions. The second one related to the natural sinks, where for land, we see that, again, there is like a wide range. Models project that either we can remain on a net sink, which can amplify, or we can, in fact, switch to a net source. And then the final one related to the high latitudes, where by 2100, as the climate warms, the thawed, sort of with permafrost thaw, the frozen carbon might actually get released into the atmosphere. Almost 5 to 15% of the current soil carbon pool will be released. I would like to take a moment to acknowledge all of the different authors, co-authors on this chapter, as well as Professor Deborah Hunsinger at Northern Arizona University, who was one of the main, my lead co-author on this chapter. And then everyone, including the review editors and some of the Soccer 2 science leads and the Federal Steering Committee people who helped put this report together. And there is one more slide here, but if we can progress, which seems stuck. But the last slide, essentially, that is sort of the set of references about sort of the key chapters that I mentioned. They have the links, and those actually will be available as, and those links are embedded into the PDF slides. But what I would also like to point out, oh, here it is now. So yeah, for any of the figures that I presented or any of the data, you can actually go and look at through these chapters. And then finally, just wanted to again reiterate or sort of underscore what Sarah mentioned. If you want more information about Soccer 2 in general, then there is a town hall tomorrow, as well as the Soccer 2 session that will be happening on Thursday. So please do come and check it out. Thanks. And now I'll be turning over to Marc. There is a little bit of lag.
Yeah. Thank you, Abhishek. Great. Well, so I'm going to be talking to you today about some new work that was recently published online that'll be coming out in the December issue of Nature Climate Change. And before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge my co-author who's in the room back there, Oliver, I don't know. And I'll be presenting on behalf of the two of us, Oliver Chadwick and myself, and focusing on some of the key findings and some of the things we did, as well as discussing some of the policy implications and carbon sequestration opportunities with this work. So what I'm going to focus on today is the global carbon cycle, the global soil carbon cycle. And one of the key findings in this paper, which I will get into more details on, is that 1/4 of the carbon held by soils was found to be bound by minerals as far as 6 feet beneath the surface. And this discovery opens up a new possibility for dealing with the element as it continues to warm, as the Earth's atmosphere continues to warm. So a little bit of background on the soil carbon cycle and the state of the knowledge. We heard from Abhishek about permafrost soils being a source of carbon as temperatures warm over the next 100 years, and a concern about thawing. At the global scale, we have a pool of about 2,300 petagrams, which is nearly 3 times the amount of carbon that we have in the atmosphere. And we know that much of that soil carbon is bound to reactive iron and aluminum-bearing minerals. And when I say bound, these are chemical bonds between the minerals and the organic matter that are ligand bonds. These are strong chemical bonds. And if you look globally at the soil carbon pool, it's known that about 90% of the carbon at depth is chemically bound with these minerals. However, what we don't know, and what the knowledge gap that we're addressing in this work, is the distribution of these minerals stored across Earth's climate zones, and consequently its overall contribution to the global soil carbon pool. So we knew that these minerals are important and they form these stable bonds, but what we haven't known is the extent to which they occur globally and how much carbon is retained by them. So to address this question in our recent study, we measured carbon held by reactive minerals at depth across a globally distributed range of climates, and these include permafrost soils. And you can see here, these are some of the soil pits that we located primarily in North America, but the data set is global. In total, we used 67 individual sites, and we sampled them to a depth of 2 meters. In our study, what we found is that for many biomes on Earth, the fraction or the proportion of organic matter at depth, which is retained by these reactive minerals, ranges from about 6% up to 72%, depending on what the climate is, which is a pretty wide range of the role of these minerals across the Earth's climate zones. Furthermore, what we found is that there's a zone of high sensitivity of the extent to which reactive minerals hold carbon, depending on the climate. And I have this area highlighted in red here. And essentially what this means is that a slight shift in effective moisture can result in a big shift in the role of these reactive minerals. And the implications of this is very high sensitivity in this area that we've identified here to a shift in climate over the next 100 years. And one of the reasons for this sensitivity is that this essentially is a water-driven mechanism whereby rainfall percolates through the forest canopy, hits the soil organic layers in the surface soils, and moves organic matter downward where it can bind with reactive minerals. As Earth's climate warms, even a slight shift in evapotranspiration or a decrease in soil moisture can essentially dry up this pathway. If we think of this as a global pathway for rainfall-driven transport and accumulation of carbon, the concern here is that there's a portion of the Earth that may lose this pathway or substantially have this pathway reduced under future climates. So as I mentioned earlier in the talk, we estimated the total amount of carbon retained by reactive minerals globally, and this is a look at that estimation and that quantification. To do this, we use the relationship which I showed you with effective moisture and reactive mineral retention, as well as global soil carbon data sets. So we combined those two and came up with a new estimate, and this is the first estimate of the global pool of carbon that's held by reactive minerals. 600 petagrams is nearly as much carbon as we have in the Earth's atmosphere, and it's more than twice as much carbon which we've emitted post-industrial, since the Industrial Revolution due to anthropogenic activities. So it's quite a large pool. And the other thing we did in this study is we evaluated biomes and the sensitivity of different biomes to the retention of reactive minerals of carbon. And what you see here, similar to what I showed you earlier, is in red is identifying which biomes are most sensitive to potential changes in climate. And essentially these range from dry to moist forest biomes. Those are the most sensitive. This area shaded in tan on the left are desert environments, and if it becomes drier and hotter in desert environments, we're not seeing that will really change much in terms of the role of reactive minerals. It's going to essentially remain low throughout this range. And conversely, in very wet biomes, there's such an excess of moisture that it's less sensitive, and so these are very wet forest biomes that we have on Earth. Hyperhumid, temperate rainforests, and tropical rainforests. That's not saying that these forests won't experience changes due to climate change. It's just that they have less sensitivity to a slight shift in the climate, whereas these dry to moist forest biomes show evidence of very high sensitivity or vulnerability. All right, so now that I've presented some of the key findings from the paper, I'm going to talk about the implications. And the first is doing a vulnerability analysis of understanding which biomes are more or less vulnerable to exposure of temperatures over the next 100 years, warming temperatures, and potential shifts in rainfall patterns. So if temperatures near the surface of the Earth warm, there can be less water moving through soils, even if precipitation amounts were to stay the same or increase. More water that does fall can be lost to evaporation and plant respiration, which would make water less available to move carbon for long-term carbon storage with reactive minerals. So knowing which of these biomes have minerally retained soil carbon pools can help us identify and do a vulnerability analysis to prioritize actions we might take in these regions on Earth. And one example of this would be maintaining forests in these climatically sensitive and vulnerable biomes, which may help preserve this pathway for carbon storage. And one example of that would be if deforestation, by contrast, were to occur, that could further reduce the strength of this pathway. And an example of that would be in Brazil, where there's a real concern that some of those rates of deforestation may increase. A concern, were that to happen, would be that this pathway may be substantially impacted in addition to the loss of the forest in those areas. I also want to address the carbon sequestration implications of what we've done. Our work highlights the role of reactive minerals in global carbon storage under a wide range of climates, as I showed you. And one idea here that I want to put forward is that emerging and novel land use practices could utilize these findings to develop new ways to increase carbon storage with minerals at depth. And when we think about land use change over the next 100 years, the real frontier for where human activity will be is in agricultural lands. Now, agricultural lands are already occupied by humans, and what may happen over the next 100 years are new opportunities on these lands to develop new land use practices that could incorporate science such as what we're presenting today, and the idea that developing farming practices that are tailored to utilize chemical binding of minerals as one approach. And we've demonstrated in prior work examples of emerging land use change and what's achievable. And we really think this is the beginning of the conversation rather than the end as far as the potential for emerging land use changes and understanding some of these relationships in the global soil carbon cycle. So a critical component of this approach, we think, would be to focus on ways to chemically bind carbon with minerals at depth. What farming practices those are, we don't have an answer for, but we believe that going forward, this has potential. And by contrast, if we look at surface mineral horizons on Earth or surface horizons in farming, topsoil amendments, that is adding organic matter to topsoil, or biochar itself may not be viable options to address climate change because those amendments are very young and they're very vulnerable to turnover. They're vulnerable to microbial breakdown. They're vulnerable to fire. They're vulnerable to drought. They're vulnerable to plowing and other disturbances. So it may well be that the last place we want to think about carbon sequestration in soils is on the surface. And if we think about chemically binding carbon to minerals at depth, we have evidence to believe that this would result in a more stable carbon pool that may persist for a longer period of time. So with that, I would like to wrap it up and thank you. So this paper, again, is to be published in the December 2018 issue of Nature Climate Change. And I've got the URL to the paper. It's now published on the online version and is available. And as well, we have several press releases on the paper, which I've listed here. I'll be presenting this in a science technical session tomorrow, and as well, I'll be doing a public affairs session in the morning, discussing, as a scientist, sort of the relationship between climate change and carbon sequestration opportunities. And finally, Oliver will be presenting on Thursday on what new big discoveries and what key findings we've had over the last 100 years in soil science. So if you get a chance, I encourage you to attend those sessions as well. So thank you.
We'd like to open this to questions from the reporters in the audience. I'd like to ask you to please state your name and affiliation when you ask your question.
I'm John Cancelosi of Freelance. And what are the minerals we're talking about here? You didn't mention any names.
Yeah, so the minerals we're talking about are crystalline and amorphous iron and aluminum bearing minerals. So these are minerals that are rich in iron, aluminum, and silica, and they often form through co-precipitation with dissolved organic carbon. When they're in soluble form, they can co-precipitate out of solution with the dissolved organic carbon.
Can you name some names of these minerals?
Allophane or ammogalite.
Other questions from reporters in the audience?
There's one in the back.
David Kramer, Physics Today. You mentioned that topsoil practices are not so good, but farming is a topsoil practice, isn't it? How do you get the how do you get down to the 6 feet below?
Yeah, that's a great question, and certainly, we're not suggesting that it wouldn't make sense to add organic matter in topsoil. That's very important for soil fertility. 90% of the nutrients for plants come from the topsoil, and topsoil is always a good thing for soils and the environment. However, it may not be the best place for long-term carbon sequestration. So incorporating activities like good topsoil management and organic matter amendments with other farming practices that harness and develop carbon storage at depth would be the approach. There are numerous possible ways to do that. I don't have a turnkey farming practice that could immediately have that result, but that's something that's ongoing as we speak, and probably next year we'd have some more tangible examples on that. Deep soil plowing would be one in the right situation. There are opportunities with subsurface micro-irrigation as well.
Brian Williams, National Geographic. There's a lot of talk and hullabaloo about active carbon capture technologies. How seriously does the scientific community take these carbon capture technologies, and which ones should we keep an eye out on?
Well, I mean, I guess I'll point out a couple things about natural carbon sequestration, which is more or less the gist of what we're talking about. I mean, it's human influenced in that, humans are farming on the land, but we're using natural elements like organic matter and the minerals that are there. And so there's less energy costs associated with thinking about natural processes and how to mimic those and maybe accelerate them than a more energy-intensive approach, such as sequestering CO2 out of the atmosphere. And I will point out also you have storage issues with any of these viable carbon capture technologies, so that there's some upfront costs that essentially you're letting nature take care of when 60 petagrams of carbon is sequestered via photosynthesis that you avoid. So I think we need a diverse portfolio with multiple approaches. I don't think anything should be off the table, but I think considering all options and evaluating the cost life cycle of each of them is what needs to be done.
Yes, thanks. My name is Rich Blassie, and I'm a freelance journalist. I write on soil sometimes. I have a question for Dr. Kramer. First, I just want to address the other question about the sequestration technologies. Back in maybe a month ago, a major report by the National Academies on negative emissions technologies.
Yeah.
And that was bullish on soils, bullish on direct air capture, carbon mineralization, a little wary about forests because of the social implications.
Yes.
But a good report. And then my question for Marc Kramer is, does your report here, does it indirectly or directly address the big mysterious question of the residual? Are you, when I talk to soil scientists, biomass scientists, they say there's a net absorption in biomass, and it's not entirely clear. Are you in some way addressing that?
You're referring to above ground carbon, residual carbon?
Biomass.
Yeah, biomass. I'm not exactly sure what pool you're referring to, so I may if I get off mark, can maybe correct me. But one example that comes to mind of what you're talking about is densification of forests and this big biomass problem we have in forests, and how to translate this sort of densification problem on our forests that are increasing threats of fire, and how to sort of leverage that and use some of that material in farming is being still a challenge. There's numerous issues with transporting that much material from the forest onto the farmlands that still haven't been worked out. I'm not sure if that's exactly what you were getting at, but does that answer your question? Or?
Well, maybe can enlarge it to all three of you. What's about the carbon cycle? What's the big open question in the accounting to all three of you?
You want to go first?
I guess so. Let's see, I can't tell. I assume okay, sounds like my mic is on. What I think you might be referring to is the fact that there's been much made of the sort of missing carbon. Are you thinking of that? Okay, I'm seeing a nod, okay. This idea that there may be carbon tied up in soils or in land biota that is not being accounted all that well, and it winds up being a closure term in the global carbon assessments. I think that's what I'm hearing in this question. I wonder if you can speak to that on the land side. Since I'm not an oceanographer, I'm going to take a pass on that.
So, I mean, first of all, it's like the global carbon budget just for 2018, or the 2018 report that just came out on Wednesday. And that actually does a pretty comprehensive assessment of all the different components of the carbon cycle. It kind of looks over a decade-long period and looks at the amount of fossil fuel emissions versus like all the different land and ocean sink. What it does have, though, or recently since last year, what they have started including is what they call as a budget uncertainty term. And that budget uncertainty term, given all the other components or like the magnitude of fossil fuel emission and the magnitude of the sinks, natural sinks that we have, that budget uncertainty term might look small. But then when we are trying to actually understand the budget as it stands now, and as well as do projections for the future, then that budget uncertainty term can increase. And part of that challenge, I think, currently, in my opinion, and I'll let the other panelists here chime in, is sort of like trying to understand what the trajectory of the permafrost carbon will be. That actually, because one, we do not have a very good estimate of how much carbon is tied up there. We have a range, but that range, again, has a pretty big uncertainty. And then in the future, what are the changes that are happening? And then what are all the processes and the mechanisms that will come into play? And 50 years down the line, or by the end of the century, where will that soil carbon end up? As well as there is an amplification effect. And so there are those understanding that I think is currently kind of a missing link, and or sort of that component is what I would say is like a big missing link in our current carbon budget assessment.
Yeah, so I mean, just thinking about the global soil carbon pool and how confident we are on our estimate of the size, the largest uncertainty is in areas where we have the fewest samples, and that certainly is in the high latitude regions. And thinking about it more globally, you know, not every country has the same distribution of data that we do in North America. And so there are, you know, the carbon cycle progressively through time, as we sample more and more regions on Earth, will become better constrained, but we simply don't have the observational data globally equally across all portions of the world at present. That number will change. I'm not sure exactly how they're using that as essentially to solve an unknown portion of the fluxes, but it's a pool size that will probably change in size. We just published a paper last year that where the size increased by 100 petagrams using some of the latest techniques in accounting for depth in soil. And that, you know, if you look at the size of that pool through time, it's progressively gotten larger and larger. About 20 years ago, it was at 1,500 petagrams. So as our science gets better and our observations increase, I would expect that pool might even increase in size in the future as well.
Do we have any questions from the chat?
We have a question from David Appel, freelance. We have two questions. One question for Abhishek. It's been reported in recent years that the Amazon forest is carbon saturated and maybe now even a small source. Do your models predict this? And if so, how might that source increase over time?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I think that's a great carbon science question. Here, the focus of the Soccer 2, or sort of what I talked about today, was primarily on North America, which encompassed US, Canada, and Mexico. So we had a pretty well-defined geographic scope. And so based on that, essentially, we have some, like, it's not necessarily the Amazon forest, but then there are certain similar type of forest characteristics that we do have within this region. And for some of them, like, yes, our model projections kind of do actually show the uncertainty in whether it will remain a sink or whether it will remain or kind of switch to a source at some point in the future. But then again, the big uncertainty there is from the land use management practices that can take place. And especially related to Marc's talk, what he showed is that depending upon the particular management practices you take, it can actually end up releasing carbon.
Okay, thank you. And the second question is for Sarah Cooley. Why do carbon scientists use petagrams instead of gigatons?
I don't know. I think some of it may come from, I think I've actually heard that some of it comes from sort of disciplinary tradition. Some disciplines use petagrams and some disciplines use gigatons. That sort of predates my entry into carbon cycle scientists. So I have to say I just don't know. But it is a good question. I wondered the same thing.
Okay, we'll have to close. Thank you.
Great.